Your biology class, everyone. This is probably your last real lesson. It's going to be a little bit longer, so you can split it over 2 days. And I will post your last quiz on Thursday. Don't forget, you have 2 weeks to make up missing work as well, and I've hyperlinked everything through Student View if you were at all lost. If you think you submitted something and it's showing as a 0, just resubmit it. Today, I'm going to go over water pollution and ways we've fixed it. This is actually so by the way, this was the old Aquaman. The picture you see on the right, no one actually knows what was in those barrels. Those were dumped in Lake Superior in the 1960s. Water pollution is any change to the water's natural state. It could be chemical, biological, or physical change that causes problems for living things or makes water unsuitable for desirable use. Biological stuff can be things like bacteria, viruses, parasitic protists, or parasitic worms. Bacteria can cause lots of problems. In the US, we chlorinate or treat our drinking water with UV light or ozone to knock down on these things to make water unsafe. Even though diarrhea doesn't seem like a big deal, diarrhea can lead to fatal consequences. But this is one reason why, especially if you're on a city water supply, your water is tested daily for safety. Protists are single-celled organisms, or usually single-celled. If you've ever gone backpacking or camping, this is why you have to filter your water, because one of the concerns with water in wilderness areas is it's often high in Giardia, which is a microscopic protist that causes really bad gastrointestinal problems. When we talk about water quality, there's lots of ways we measure it. That's why I showed you some videos, or gave you that video earlier this week of different simple ways you can test out the water. Just remember, the Poudre River is going to start cresting this week, so please be careful around it. For those of you who swim, this is one of the ways we test swimming pools to make sure they're safe. What they do is they grow in a petri dish, and there's a gel they put in the petri dish called agar. And what they do is they'll put in a measured sample of water and let it grow on the petri dish. If there's any bacteria in there, it will make these little colonies or dots that you can clearly see. In the case of drinking water in the US, when they test the water, they have to see 0 colonies for 100 milliliters of water. This is for fecal coliform, which is a bacteria found in our poo. Now, to gross you out, they accept up to 200 colonies for swimming pools. This is why I prefer swimming in lakes and oceans, but I still swim in pools. Chemical analysis, you saw me do a Winkler titration. One thing is we can't just get a broad spectrum test for everything. Each individual chemical or thing has to be tested individually. What you see in this picture are just 4 chemical tests done in aquariums. And to run these tests usually takes about an hour. A lot of chemical tests are very expensive and require technical training. For those of you who are on rural water, like I grew up on a well, we found out that you don't actually have to run the test yourself. You can send them to the county health department or any state research lab, and they'll often test your water for you. You also saw me showing some living organisms in the video. That's a really cool way of testing water quality because it's simple, it's easy to do, and it gives you a broad analysis of everything just by looking for invertebrates. Cool thing about this is this was actually developed by a high school student originally in Chicago. When we talk about pollution, there's 2 types. You often think about pollution as just being big, bad pipes pumping stuff directly into the water, but a lot of stuff is, and that would be point source. Non-point source means it's all of us. So here's an example of point source. You can see directly where the spill, in this case in Lake Michigan, entered the water. It came from one single source. So this would be like the big pipe pumping stuff directly in. Most water pollution is not point source. Most comes from all of us. This map here shows you the Mississippi River watershed. And what's going on here is anyone here using nitrates, which are found in fertilizers especially, or even from wastewater from water treatment plants that are also high in nitrates, all of that is pouring out right in Louisiana into the Gulf of Mexico. And so in this case, it's everybody using fertilizers, every water treatment plant that is not fully removing nutrients from the water are causing a giant plume of algae we'll talk about in the Gulf of Mexico. Here are major water pollutants that we're often worried about for water quality. Nutrients, acid rain, oil, sewage, temperature, plastics, and heavy metals. Nutrients, going with the Gulf of Mexico, increasing nutrients is called eutrophication. And the main nutrients that we're worried about in water are nitrates and phosphates. The picture you see on the right, you can see a eutrophic or green scummy mess. When eutrophication happens, algae increases growth rate, so do other plants. Then we have decreased dissolved oxygen, which is the oxygen dissolved in the water, and the fish will literally just die off because there's no oxygen. If you've gone to Sheldon Pond, you've seen, or I think they call it Lake Sheldon. Anyhow, that is a eutrophic scummy mess, primarily from goose poop. So that is one reason why, if you notice, there are little air bubbles coming up in the lake because they're constantly adding oxygen and air to the lake to keep things from dying and to keep the entire place from smelling like rotten eggs. In the case of acid rain, the lakes become acidic and all fish die off. The way they treat it is they add powderized limestone to the lake. This has actually been decreasing in recent years because car manufacturers have changed the emissions on cars, and factories are also reducing the two gases, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, that we're adding to acid rain. I'll tell you about the experiment about how they figured out why fish were dying. The fish weren't dissolving, by the way. They weren't getting burned by the acid. Oil spreads across the surface. If it coats an animal, the animal will suffocate. It's toxic if ingested. And the biggest source of oil is not oil spills from big companies. It's everybody's car dripping in parking lots. That would be non-point source. Increasing temperature of water is a huge problem. Warm water dissolves less gas. If you are incredibly bored, freeze 2 ice cubes. Make one with boiling hot water and one with cold tap water. The one with hot water will freeze faster and the ice will be clearer because hot water has less dissolved gas. The sources of increased temperature include things like cooling towers from power plants, which are often adding superheated water. But another source you can see right here in the Front Range, all those parking lots and all those open areas without trees, the ground gets really hot. When water flows across those into the river, you add hot water to the rivers as well. The issue with this is warmer water can lead to fish not having enough oxygen, but also as you warm the temperature of water, fish actually need to eat more because their metabolism goes up. Plastics, you've all heard about plastics. Plastics don't biodegrade. They strangle animals, they choke animals, and over time, you can even see in this plastic, it's breaking up into smaller pieces. We'll talk more about plastics in a second. Heavy metals come mostly from mining waste, electronic waste, and burning of fossil fuels. Heavy metals can cause things like brain damage. They can bioaccumulate. This includes things like lead, mercury, arsenic, cobalt, and chromium. My neighbors, or my parents' neighbors growing up, both developed dementia in recent years. The husband was really cheap and he fed his family fish, or fed his wife fish that he caught in the lake. If you are into fishing, you've probably noticed that they have fish limits, not just for how many fish you're allowed to catch, but you often have to look for how many fish you can eat from the lake. He was eating fish higher up on the food chain that were high in mercury. Looking back on it, his family realized after he passed away and his wife passed away, they actually had mercury poisoning. They didn't have dementia, which causes significant brain damage, and they just thought they both had Alzheimer's. So these are the things we usually measure with water. pH is the measure of acidity. Temperature is obvious. Dissolved oxygen, you saw me do that with the Winkler titration. Nutrient levels, we usually measure with chemical tests, but you can also measure the turbidity or the murkiness of the water. So with streams, we already talked about this. Streams are a big concern here in Colorado. Most of our water is moving, so it's in streams and rivers. In the case of Fort Collins in Larimer County, we've done a significant amount of effort to improve the flow of the Poudre River. So if you get the chance while maintaining social distancing, you should check out the river park, the Whitewater Park restoration that they did right in the middle of the city. It's awesome. Tailings piles, by the way, are powdered rock left over from mining operations. These things look like they'd be fun to climb on, but they're high in heavy metals. And when water flows through this, they're like coffee grounds of doom. So we'll skip. So groundwater is not as much of a concern for us here in the Front Range because we drink water directly from the Poudre River. But most of the country drinks groundwater, which is water found underneath the ground. It's not flowing in underground rivers, it's everywhere underneath us. If you dug straight down, eventually the hole would form a puddle if you got dug down deep enough, and you've discovered groundwater. So one reason why cities have to test their water is they're constantly looking for a lot of these things that could end up and cause health problems in the drinking water. In the US, about 25% of the US groundwater is contaminated. So all aquifers or groundwater in New Jersey is unsafe for drinking without human treatment. So they do treat it before it goes to cities. About half of city water has organic chemicals that they have to remove. 1/3 of industrial waste ponds and lagoons have no liners. So waste ponds, I'll show you a picture in a second. If you've seen the movie Aaron Brockovich, that was the result of a waste pond. But we'll show that. Actually, I'll show that to you now. Where is the waste pond? I do not have a picture of the waste pond. So a waste pond is basically a pool of toxic water that they let evaporate and then they skim off the toxic materials so it doesn't get in the groundwater. If they don't line it with plastic, it will flow into the groundwater anyhow. Ocean pollution. In the old days, and this quote is from a textbook from 20 years ago, shows you how backwards adults are. Oceans can dilute, disperse, and degrade large amounts of sewage. This has been discouraged because now we understand with ocean circulation, when we put something in the ocean, it doesn't stay put, it goes all over the world. So this is not a good solution. Here's when we discovered it wasn't a good solution. Where my family's originally from is New Jersey. In the 1980s, hypodermic needles washed up on the shore of New Jersey because New York City used to barge their garbage out into the ocean and then sink the barge to get rid of it. This became a concern because in the 1980s, we switched from glass hypodermic needles to plastic ones. The glass ones would break and sink. The plastic ones floated and they washed up on the shore. There were cases where kids were stepping on these needles on the beach on the Jersey Shore, and some of them even contained active viruses of HIV. So this is our other concern with ocean dumping. All the plastics are rapidly accumulating, and you've heard about the plastic garbage patch. There's actually 2 in the Atlantic, or 2 in the Pacific, and there's 1 in the North Atlantic. Sometimes when the wind blows, they look like this, but usually it's tiny plastic floating under the water. Over time, the plastic breaks into smaller pieces, but it doesn't degrade. And then fish and birds eat these, and it fills their stomach and causes health problems, including some cases, the animals are just starving with a full stomach, but it's all plastic. So for dumping, the US is pretty cautious. We don't dump much in the ocean, but a lot of developing countries, so about 80% of the population of the world, is still dumping sewage and industrial waste untreated into the ocean. The worst ocean pollution is near these areas. Important thing to understand, though, is this is where a lot of US manufacturing happens. So often when you're buying something really cheap that's manufactured in one of these countries, one reason why it's so cheap is there's no environmental regulation in those countries. Now let's talk about what happens to the stuff that flushes out of your house. So we're going to talk about all of the water coming out of your house. Just so you know, black water is the term for the stuff that comes from your toilet. The rest of your house, the wastewater, is gray water, but it's all put together in the city sewer pipes. If you're on a septic tank, this is done in your backyard. So there's 3 stages of treatment. And rather than taking you to a water treatment plant, here's a picture of one. Primary treatment is mechanical. It's getting out the floaters and the sinkers and the solids. They use screens at the top and the bottom, and they just skim off all of the solids. If you go to a water treatment plant, this is where you will see that they're skimming off things like all of the Lysol wipes that people are flushing, even though they're not supposed to. You can also see things like condoms and undigested corn coming out in primary treatment. Right over here is primary treatment. Secondary treatment is using decomposition. It's biological. They're using bacteria to remove the stuff. And they'll often do it in 2 separate things. So you'll have some tanks like these right here that are using oxygen. Other tanks are covered so that there is no oxygen, and those two things combined remove a lot of the secondary wastes. And then the third option, which as you see right here, is nutrient removal called tertiary treatment. This is optional, but in the Northeast, they're now requiring this in all water treatment plants because that's decreasing eutrophication of oceans. The things that aren't removed are plastics, pharmaceuticals, and nutrients. And nutrients, remember, can lead to eutrophication. So let's skip that slide. So here's another diagram of it. So you have primary treatment, removing the floaters and sinkers. And by the way, those things end up going into a landfill. The secondary ones are aeration tanks and settling tanks. And then one thing that we do if the water is going to become drinking water, or if we're putting it back in surface water, is they disinfect it with chlorine, UV light, or ozone. These days, we usually are switching to UV light or ozone. And there's a water treatment plant. Now, one thing that we're still trying to fix in the US is if you've been to coastal areas, sometimes you'll see beaches are closed after heavy rainstorms. In older cities, the stormwater, which is the stuff that comes from the sky, tends to go to the same water treatment plant as the sewage that's coming out of your households. Cities like Fort Collins have separated their stormwater from their sewage, but older cities haven't. So if you have a heavy rainstorm, all of that goes to the sewage treatment plant. And if you imagine a bucket is not infinite in its volume, if that water treatment plant is overloaded, they're allowed to just dump everything into rivers and oceans and lakes. And so that means in coastal areas, you have these risks sometimes after rainstorms, and all of that is from people swimming in diluted sewage. Remember, though, in the US, this is getting a lot better. Oil spills. The way you deal with oil spills are you have to clean them up, obviously. One way that we clean them up are with these weird materials that will not absorb water. They only absorb oil. Because oil doesn't degrade. Salt in sunlight will turn it into tar bubbles. If you've listened to the song Bubbly Toes by Jack Johnson, there is a line about picking tar. Bubbly toes refers to picking the tar out from between your toes after surfing all day. So we've talked about some of the health problems with it. The ways you clean it up are you can use soap to disperse it, which is discouraged because that doesn't get rid of it. If you add soap to oil and water, the oil dissolves in the water. Absorbent materials like this boom you see here work well. There's also some bacteria that can break down oil. The easiest thing to do is prevent oil spills. Change your oil at a place where they recycle the oil. Fix any signs of oil leaks on cars and boats. And if you have a boat, the Coast Guard is encouraging people to put these in those weird compartments below by the engine, where there's a little bit of water called bilge water. They're little sheets of fabric that absorb the oil that naturally drips off of a boat engine. But now let's talk about pollution of lakes and rivers. One important thing to know is phosphates, as I mentioned in the video, pollute fresh water. They're what cause algae blooms in fresh water. Here is a picture of eutrophication, by the way. So the way eutrophication happens is nutrients enter the water. It can run off across the surface, or it can soak into the ground and enter through the base of the lake or river, and that would be called leaching. And it causes algae, and fish suffocate, and plus the algae die. We often call them harmful algae blooms. If you watch the news, this is happening in Florida now about every August. And what we now understand is it's nitrates cause it in salt water and phosphates cause it in fresh water. Just remember, phosphates are fresh. Here is how we found this out. This was one of my professors in college. When he was in college back in the 70s, they did this experiment. They found what happened was we noticed that lakes were going eutrophic at an increasing rate in the 50s and 60s. We already knew in oceans, nitrates cause algae blooms. So we were wondering if it might be nitrates, but then other people were suggesting it might be phosphates, which is an entirely different chemical. So nitrates, the main source for nitrates are water treatment plants and fertilizers. The main source of phosphates in the 70s was laundry detergent. So the Canadian government cut a lake in half with a plastic curtain. They loaded the upper half, the north half, with phosphates. The southern half was loaded with nitrates. After a few months, this is what they saw. This is a really cool picture because it led to banning of phosphates in laundry detergents throughout North America. And as soon as we did that, we started improving water quality of our lakes and rivers. There's a close-up of the picture too. So in the 80s and 90s, another professor I worked with did the similar experiment, and it was a 25-year experiment. He passed away towards the tail end, and his wife, who was also a lake scientist, finished the experiment for him. The way we found out how fish die in lakes that go acidic was hard to figure out. When they did it in aquariums, if they lowered the pH to the level of an acidic lake, which fresh water is usually a pH of 6, neutral is 7. Acidic water for lakes is a pH of 5. But when they tried to put fish in aquariums and they brought the pH to 5, the fish were fine. So this was Little Rock Lake, right by where I grew up. And Professor Tom Frost, as well as his wife, Susan Harris, they cut the lake in half with another plastic curtain. And they figured out the experiment from the Canadian government, and they added added acid to one half of the lake slowly over 5 years. They actually did it with a really cool system. They had modified outboard motors designed by Evinrude that had a funnel on top, and graduate students and college students spent their summers driving circles around the lake and slowly adding sulfuric acid to the lake over a 5-year period. After 5 years, though, the pH of the lake, their goal was to bring it down to a pH of 5. It hadn't changed at all. One of the things they did discover by accident was lakes in Wisconsin have a bacteria that neutralize acid. The awesome thing is the professor continued adding acid for another few years. What they found out was it was the food web itself had changed. The tasty plankton had died off, and that was the base of the food chain, and they were replaced with something that no one wanted to eat. And that was why the fish passed away. By the way, this is Susan, the wife of the professor, also professor herself, who now runs the research lab. Their experiment lasted for 30 years. For the last 15 years, they stopped adding acid, and they discovered the lake would heal itself if we just stopped adding more acid rain. But here's some other examples of things getting better, because I thought we should end your bio class with some good news. Since the 1970s, we've ratcheted up our water quality laws through the Clean Water Act. So we've increased the number and quality of wastewater treatment plants. And to show you really good news, I'm going to show you the most polluted river in the history of the United States. This is the Cuyahoga River that flows into Lake Erie in Ohio. It caught fire a few times in the 1970s. After the fire, there was this scummy tar. And this was the mayor of the town sticking his hand in the tar to show how toxic and gross it was. He actually got some chemical burns from it, but I believe he recovered fine. Let me show you what 50 years of regulation has done to the Cuyahoga River. Ready? It's all clean now. There's fish in it. The fish are safe to eat. So this is awesome good news. Here's some other really cool success stories. New York Harbor, this is where I used to work when I was in my 20s. I actually lived on this boat right here. There was no heat on it, so it was a little chilly in the winter. There also wasn't running water, so I had to use showers at friends' houses. The reason I was working here is right out of college, I was hired to work on this boat to teach water quality and ecology to the students of New York City. So this boat would take students out 2 or 3 times a day for 3 hours and teach them about the ecology of New York Harbor. While I was working there, they noticed that the water quality was finally getting better, which no one thought was ever going to happen in New York. When I lived there, if you fell into New York Harbor in 2000, you had to go to the emergency room for some immunization shots, antibiotics, and generally was as well as a few vaccines. New York Harbor 20 years later is now so clean, there is an open water swim team that will swim around the Statue of Liberty. The other thing is, as the water quality improved, a lot of life returned to the harbor. New York's solution, they modeled after a different area called Chesapeake Bay, which is about 2 hours south of New York City. This is Chesapeake Bay. It's a kind of large river where it meets the ocean called an estuary. The population of this area had skyrocketed, and if you look, the dissolved oxygen, where you see red, if fish swim in there, they will die, and that area just smells like rotten eggs. In the old days, we would just blame the people living right on the water for being at fault. What we now understand is we have to manage an entire watershed, which is, if you think about it, water flows downhill. So if you factor in everything uphill, you have to regulate all of that. So they started doing things like regulating wastewater treatment plants to remove nutrients. They changed the policies on who could use fertilizers, and they even started regulating other things. And they also, and in the end, they improved the water quality significantly. Oysters are now growing again in Chesapeake Bay. So, and that solution is called integrated coastal management. And it's managing the entire watershed. And I'll show you what happened in Long Island Sound next. And one of their main goals was to decrease nutrient loads by 40%. But they also wanted to restore these things called salt marshes. These are salt marshes. They look like prairies, but they're on the edge of the ocean. And being a kid from the Midwest, the first time I saw a salt marsh, I was in my 20s and I was so excited, I tried to run through it, not realizing the salt marsh is kind of mushy, and I ended up sinking down to my waist, and I was in dress clothes for a fancy dinner party for one of my captains on a research boat, looking like an idiot. The cool thing about salt marshes, though, is their root structure goes down about 4 feet. There's bacteria on the roots that can neutralize oil runoff. The plants themselves pull nutrients out of the water. They provide habitat for young animals. And even more amazing, they protect shorelines from floods and erosion because the roots are absorbent and literally suck up a storm surge. This is also where you can see little fiddler crabs running around. By the 1980s, we only had about 5% of the salt marshes left on the East Coast. Since then, high school programs have replanted them all along, and we have actually increased the total holdings of salt marshes significantly. And there's other pictures of salt marshes. So this is why they're awesome. They reduce erosion, they reduce flooding, they reduce nutrients, and they reduce non-point pollution. You just don't want to run through them. So Long Island Sound was one of those areas where they also did integrated coastal management. And Long Island Sound was kind of a polluted nightmare until the early 2000s. To give you an idea, this is about 110 miles long. This is about 20 miles across. New York City is right here. And if you've seen the movie Great Gatsby, or preferably read the book, this right here is Larchmont Yacht Club, where F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote the book, The Great Gatsby. So in the case of Long Island Sound, it was so polluted, they hadn't seen dolphins there for over 100 years. And if you go to places along the Connecticut coast, everybody has dolphin-themed everything because, the cool thing about Long Island Sound was one of their goals was to improve this water quality so dolphins returned. Because the health of the sound was a disaster. The fishing industry collapsed, the oyster industry collapsed. There was increased runoff of basically poop in the sound. They hadn't seen dolphins in 60 years, and heavy metal contamination, and even the lobster industry was failing. So that is not me in the picture. But I also worked on this boat right out of college for about 4 months. We did the same thing as the other boat. This was the Soundwaters based in Stamford, Connecticut. We did the same thing here where we brought school kids out on the boat because one of the ways to fix environmental problems is recognizing that young people are far more powerful than old people. So now that I'm done teaching you, I can tell you that you have far more power than I do. What we did on these boats, and this program has been in effect for about 35 years now, is every day they would take out about 120 students and teach them about water quality, the sound, including things like, if you want to see the dolphins again, this is what we need to do as a community. We would pull a net behind the boat and collect animals off the bottom, like these flounders you see these two guys holding. And it was a really powerful experience. And now just imagine all these kids going home and telling their parents, we need to do things differently so the dolphins return. So when you combine this education with the integrated coastal management that happened for Long Island Sound, it was huge. And to give you an idea, do you see this? This is a population map. This whole area flows into Long Island Sound. It's part of the Long Island Sound watershed. It goes all the way up into Vermont, New Hampshire, and Canada. Another way to think about it is about 30% of the US population lives in the watershed for Long Island Sound. There is actually a map at night. You can see this whole area is densely populated. So this is all Long Island Sound's watershed. This was photographed 10 years ago, and right over here is Larchmont Yacht Club, where F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. These were dolphins feeding and healthy in Long Island Sound. Now dolphins are seen there regularly and they're healthy. So after decades of effort, dolphins did return to Long Island Sound. But it wasn't just Long Island Sound that got better, it was also New York Harbor. Here's a humpback whale feeding right off the Statue of Liberty. And in one case, one of the ferries that goes between Staten Island and New York City had to stop and wait for the whale to get out of the way. Here's another picture of the humpback whale. And now they're seeing humpback whales in the Sound. So there is now a triathlon that's getting proposed for New York City. There's an open water swimming. You can rent kayaks and stand up paddle boards in the harbor. And all of that changed in 20 years, which shows you how, if we all work together, things can get better. Oh, and we'll skip that. So that was your lesson on water pollution. And I will post the notes. Hope you are all doing well. This video you can watch for day 2 and day 3. And then there will be a quiz posted Thursday morning. Thank you.